Hello, everybody. Two things seems to be going on in our contemporary culture. On the one hand, we have technologies which are profoundly changing our futures: AI, biotech, many other technologies, most often associated with where I'm living in the San Francisco Bay Area. And in parallel, and perhaps in conflict, many of us are nervous about our futures. We're not sure how they're going to turn out. We feel disempowered. We don't feel as if we are participating in our future. They're being authored from somewhere else. My two guests on the show are both particularly interested in the future. They are the co-authors of an intriguing new book. It's called Assembling Tomorrow. It's a book about how to make our own futures, a guide to designing a thriving future from the Stanford D School, the Stanford Design School. Carissa Carter and Scott Dooley both teach at that D School. And I'm thrilled they're joining us today. Let's start with you, Carissa. Is agency about the future the heart of this new book that you've written with Scott?
Hi, Andrew. Well, thank you for having us. It's great to be here. Agency about the future is really important. Scott and I are in the field of making things and teaching others how to do that. And even for us, it is a super overwhelming moment, like you were saying. The tech we're making with has the potential to do a lot of good and also a lot of harm. Our climate's in dire straits. We can edit genetic code, release algorithms that learn on their own, and it can feel like all of this is happening to us. But as makers and people that teach design, we know how much agency we all have. And that was really the impetus for the book, to say, hey, yeah, there is an urgency to the unsettling moment we're in, and we can pave a path forward that any of us can take on.
Scott, as I said at the beginning, you both teach at Stanford D School, Stanford University being perhaps, if there is a ground zero for the American innovation economy, it's at Stanford. It's, of course, where companies like Google were quite literally born. And in fact, Terry Winograd, who I think was the tutor of the two founders of Google, is also a founder of the D School. Do you think you have a particular moral responsibility, given how problematic much of our technological future is? We were promised, for example, from Google that they would do no evil. And many people see Google as a particularly good example of a big tech company that has benefited itself and its investors, but nobody else.
Yeah, I mean, I will say, things have changed quite a bit since Google was founded, say, in 1999, particularly around how the students approach problem solving. So I think the culture, not just at Stanford, but sort of around the world, was a lot about, how can we do something big? Steve Jobs had the how can we make a dent in the universe, and there was kind of this attitude of creating big things. And over the years, the students that we see coming towards us and the way that we're teaching at the D School is really about creating something that's going to be useful in the world for more people in more ways. And so our students don't come in now just saying like, hey, I want to do a big startup. They really come in trying to think about like, what is the change that we're trying to make in the world? And how are the things that we're making going to impact that? And in some ways, that's a much more complicated problem because you have to take a lot more things into account. But in other ways, it's just another way to look at things, and the students are equally passionate and excited about it as anyone might be to just become an entrepreneur.
Carissa, why should, and I'm not blaming you for how we seem to have collectively screwed up our future. You mentioned all the technologies, particularly the environmental ones, which are so problematic. We certainly can't blame Stanford for most of that, and Stanford University. But why should we trust all this happy talk now coming out of Stanford from people like yourself and Scott and the D School? It's still for elites. It's all very well to say, well, we want to make the world a better place. But ultimately, most of the people who go to Stanford, and I know this quite personally because my wife was a graduate there, go on to become wealthy and powerful people. So why should we trust what Stanford is telling us about making a better future?
Well, I think, from the perspective of our book, we're not trying to tell you how it is and here's how you have to do it. we are trying to paint different starting places that absolutely anybody can take on, whether or not they are specialists in a given technology. One of our mottos is you don't have to know the code, meaning you don't have to be a specialist in doing that programming, but you do have to know what that code can do. You do have to be versed in, well, here's the type of shift this type of algorithm might be able to cause in the world. Um, and the way that we can make that possible for all of us to have those conversations and be able to feel like we're part of shaping this next wave of technology is through a lot of the level setting in getting literate in what our technologies can do right now, trying on ways of disorienting ourselves from the way that we think life like needs to happen or happens around us in our everyday lives. And so I think it's less asking for trust and more, hey, let's try this on. Let's try this on and see how it works for you and make it work in your own context.
Scott, you like this term, design is a conversation. You're on our mutual friend Matt Anderson's, Matt Abrams' Think Fast, Talk Smart show. He also teaches at Stanford. You describe design as a conversation. I have to admit, and maybe I'm just a reactionary old fart, that the word conversation to me brings out my worst instincts. It's such a meaningless word. So, in my mind, at least, what do you mean by design being a conversation?
I think that might have come out of that podcast. I don't recall saying that specifically, but I'm happy to dive in there. I think design, there are many ways to bring something into the world, right? You can bring it in as a business person, you can bring it in as an engineer. Design's a particular way of approaching the world. And a lot of it has to do with the fact that you're trying to figure out what's useful in the world. And so you're not trying to just say, like, oh, I'm going to think about this thing and I'm going to put it out there. You're trying to test it along the way. You're trying to see where it's going to fail. You're trying to create something that's going to be useful for other people.
But doesn't
And
that, sorry to jump in here, doesn't that go without saying? It's obvious.
I mean, I guess. I mean, you asked the question, so I'm trying to put some color to it. Another way to think about it is like, if business is about viability, how you can bring something into the world and make money off of it and have it be a sustainable effort, and engineering's about feasibility. Will this work? Is this possible? Design's really about desirability. Like, is this useful in the world? Should this be out there? And so that's our focus. And I think the thing I would say, just to, like, if you want to dig into the conversation side of it, so much of design is about responding to the things that you put out there. So if you put something out and it doesn't go well, you should be responsible to change it.
Isn't that true for anything? I mean, it's not unique to design.
I guess, like, it probably is true for many ways of doing, but I think the methods that design uses are really much more not about, like, what's the genius of the entrepreneur. It's what's the understanding of how the world works. So it is sort of a little bit more, I think, than other ways of doing, focused on seeing, like, are the assumptions that I have working? Is that the right thing?
Carissa, Stanford's an incredibly difficult place to get into. I think it's even harder now to get into Stanford as an undergrad than Harvard or Princeton. I don't know what the numbers are. 1 in 100, 2, 3 in 100 kids get in, and those are the ones who apply. And yet these are the institutions that promote what I think of as the democratization of things. You touched on that earlier in terms of design. It's not your ideology, but I know the ideology of the D School is that we believe, and I'm quoting from your D School website, we believe everyone has the capacity to be creative. And I know that in Assembling Tomorrow, you talk about this, but isn't it a bit rich for an elitist, for better or worse, maybe a meritocratically elite college institution like Stanford that are producing American elites to be peddling the idea of the democratization of design when only a very few privileged smart kids get to design the stuff that you're developing at Stanford?
I think there's another shift that we're seeing in higher ed in general and here at Stanford with our designers, and a shift that we've made within our own programs within the last 2 years. And that has to do with the fact that design as a discipline is newer. It's newer to the world than math, right? Everybody goes through high school and takes math, and only a small fraction of students have taken any design, let alone even know what design is when they leave high school and come to university. And here at Stanford is a place where one of the main places where American design has grown and morphed and developed. And so, given that, what we see, it's our responsibility to introduce more people to it, both within our purview here at Stanford, but then sharing what we know with the world in terms of our writing and publishing. So here at Stanford, we have created a brand new course that launched last year, Design One, which is for first year students, right? Like previously, there was no design accessibility until you were a third year student. But we want people who have never heard of this discipline to see themselves in it. And that actually has helped our number of majors really rise. And the diversity of who's enrolling in the major are not people that are predisposed to thinking of themselves, to use your term, as elites, but really as people who want to make change in the communities that they're from or others that they're associated with. So I'm very heartened with what I see here on campus. And then, like, the other part of our mandate as the D School is to help charge and enlighten the public imagination with what we know, because we all know that, I mean, in my own life, there are a few, like, I saw this quote somewhere and that really has stuck with me forever. And if we can spark ideas in people, no matter where they are, no matter if they've attended Stanford or not, like, we feel that's important. So we're trying to use the platform that we do have in ways that can really benefit a lot of people.
So I think, Carissa, I've been a little unfair in not even getting you to define what design means. And then perhaps after you've tried to define it, we'll come to Scott, because we talk about this word as if, and you know this a million times better than I do, we all use the word, but most of us don't really know what we mean by it. And the one thing that you do at the D School and in your work is define exactly what design means.
We do. And, you know, we think of everything, like, look around you in the room you're sitting in, the desk you're at, the car you're listening to this in. Everything was designed. If it was made by a human, somebody designed it. Whether or not that's designed well or not, that's up to you. But, like, everything's designed, and it's all these, it's designed on many layers and they're all interconnected. A lot of people made a lot of design decisions. This phone here, physical design, it has digital products on it. Those digital products were designed. This device that I'm holding, this phone, like, enables any number of experiences to happen. You have phone calls with people and video calls on the other side of the world. Products, experiences are designed, nested in any number of systems in the world. I get service where AT&T thinks I should have connectivity. That was a system that's designed. If you want an app from the App Store, the way that system works, both uploading and pulling from it, was designed. And then the technology that powers this device and anything really has been designed too, from the algorithms that know to autocorrect my name to carrot and carcass, right, to the data sets that decide, here's where the data set starts and here's where it stops. So data, technology, product, experience, system, all designed, all with implications in the world, near term and longer term consequences. And so we think of it as the discipline really holistically. You may be somebody that ends up focusing in one of those areas, but you have to be aware of that larger context.
And that's a lovely description. Scott, are societies designed?
Oh man, what a fantastic question, and one that's hard to answer. I do think, yes, to some degree they're designed, but a lot of that design can come out of the interactions between the things that we create. So to some degree, yes, like say policies are definitely designed, right? The digital tools that we use, even at the scale of the entire internet, are designed. but then they interact in ways and create things that, you know, are unexpected to us. They might not even have been intended by the designer. And that's actually part of what the book's about, is that as people who make things, which we all do, I mean, Carissa mentioned that design as sort of a professional discipline is very new, but design as a human action is older than language. You know, we've been building tools before we've been communicating through language. So everyone creates, and if everyone's creating things, everyone's designing. But a lot of times the impacts of those things that we design are very hard to understand until they scale, frankly, but then also until they, uh, you know, they have their impact on the world. And that's part of the book is how do we understand that better, and how do we sort of anticipate those things before they happen? And it's a tricky problem.
Yeah, Carissa, design is historically it's always been thought of in a theological sense. People always imagine the universe as being designed by some greater force. Is there a theology to design, even if you don't believe in the traditional notions of God?
Ooh, it's a question I've never had before. Um, maybe I'll take it. Maybe I'll take that question and take it in the direction of, to me, I see that force having to do with nature and the natural world. And I do believe that our harmony with the planet is something that, yeah, you know, there's been talks of sustainability and cradle to grave, you know, in terms of like building and designing cradle to cradle, etc. That has been in the ethos for a long time, biomimicry as well. But I feel like we are on the brink of a breakthrough in our understanding of uh, plant biology and how we truly are working with the natural world. And I think that there's I want to say it's theological, but to me, I think that there are powers we still do not understand. Our ways of experiencing the world are very human, and we tend to only take that human lens in our own lens. And knowing the layering on my experience as a person with yours, with Scott's, like that adds multiple perspectives and richness. But then getting beyond the human experience and understanding the many stakeholders around us, I think that's a place for exploration too.
I know that you guys think of design as values, and you've written about this, Scott. And Carissa was talking about algorithms. She held up her smartphone as an example of design. Some people see technology as a set of values, but do values produce design or the other way around? Where's the beginning of all this? Where do we
Right.
get our values if values are behind our design?
Yeah, I mean that's a fantastic question, and it's not one way or the other. It's a chicken and an egg kind of thing. It's a loop, and that's another one of the things that we talk about in the book is how much are the things we create affect our thinking. And actually, frankly, like right now, because, you know, not that we're still not in the industrial era, obviously, we're still producing a lot of industrial objects, but we have moved into this more media centric era. And when we're working with media, actually the landscape or the environment of the media is not, you know, the earth, although it is when we have data centers that are using a lot of electricity, but a lot of it's just our neurons, right? We're acting on our feelings, we're acting on our imagination. And so we don't create in a vacuum. These things that we make do have a huge impact on us. And I think one of our points of view is really that you should step back and notice how these things are affecting you. Because if you don't, as a designer, you then just reflect them right back into the world, right? So if you don't take a second to step back and kind of understand how the world is influencing you, you're just going to push something back into the world that you might not even be aware of. And of course, people aren't perfect, so just stepping back is, you know, not going to solve all our problems in the world. But taking a moment to really understand what these things are doing to us, so we're not just sort of perpetuating them even more, or at least not perpetuating the things we don't like even more, is a really important part of being somebody who puts things out into the world.
I mean, Carissa, you both teach at Stanford at the D School. We've done some other shows with professors at Stanford, particularly in computer science and political science. There was a book written a couple of years ago focusing on giving the kids at Stanford a more moral education, underlining how responsible they are for the future and trying to avoid perhaps the Facebooks and the Ubers of the world who haven't always behaved as responsibly as they should. In terms of your design education, do you always begin with that moral code or that moral reminder that design is all powerful and that they're shaping the world, and that it's not just about making money, but being responsible, being, as another guest we've had on the show, being a good ancestor?
I love that book, Roman Kisner, The Good
Yeah.
Ancestor. Yeah, he was on the show. Actually, that book was really influential in my thinking a couple of years ago too. And this ethos of designing for generations beyond you is one that we actually are beginning to work into our degrees. If you're an undergraduate design major, you know which class Design 101 is? It's the history and ethics of design, because we believe that understanding how to have go through ethical decision making is going to be something that happens as you move up, as you go through all of your classes. As a field, as a design discipline, there's been a lot of excellent examples over the last couple years of designers trying on, writing like their own type of Hippocratic oaths.
Mm.
What should there be something like that exists for the discipline? Like, I'm heartened to see that as part of the designer discussion now. And in our realms that we have control over, we're working on embedding it across our curriculum too.
Scott, you get a lot of multidisciplinary students at the D School, from business students to computer programmers to social scientists to people who study the humanities. Unfortunately, the humanities seem to be shrinking. Are there groups of students who are more or less receptive to your argument about the centrality of design and their moral responsibility in coming up with stuff that will benefit their ancestors?
Yeah, I don't know that I would categorize it by domain. Certainly, each one of those groups are taught different ways of thinking, right? So they're going to bring in a different perspective. A business person might be thinking about efficiency. An engineer might be thinking about, the responsibility of something serving someone well. A humanities person might be thinking about, the ethics or the cascading impact critically over time. The main thing we want to do is make sure that all those perspectives are being shared across the group, because we think in a lot of cases, the problems that we're facing are not single domain problems, they're multi-domain problems. So, if we're talking about climate change, or even just trying to design technology in this interconnected world that we have right now, let alone AI, those are all, the AI is, a solution, but mixed into all these problems is there are just so many pieces, similar to the way that Carissa described the phone, right? It's not just the phone, it's the supply chain. It's not just the app, it's the effect that it has on people and the way it affects people and the way it changes their behavior. And all those things need to be taken into account. So we don't see, it just feels like interdisciplinarity is just key no matter what.
But Carissa, if you've got a kid who's majoring in environmental studies, the likelihood is that they have a rather bleak view of the current state of the environment and that they're working on a career to make the world a better place. Whereas if they're a law student or a business student, they might be more open to working with fossil fuel companies. Are there certain kind of students who come in or almost already ideologically pre-packaged and you have to undo them, smash them up a bit?
I mean, again, like, I don't think that falls on disciplinary lines. I think there is a really fascinating conversations happening in the spaces of education right now, in particular K-12 education, and
Mm.
our colleagues that are very tapped into how technology, specifically AI and generative AI, is now being adopted into ed tech arenas. Like, I think those are some of the interesting what kind of programming, unprogramming in terms of learning for our younger students is needed. And, like, we're seeing a lot of amazing change in how K-12 education is working, right? Like social emotional learning is a huge thread. We're much more aware of learning differences and teaching to multiple ways of taking in information versus just, teaching people who read to learn. And at the same time, we're in a world where we're trying to force fit like generative AI into those spaces because of potential opportunities, and is this a place to apply this technology? And I think that there are people saying, hey, let's pump the brakes on this, but there's also a little unease. But the reality is how we learn and take in information is different depending on how you were schooled. And part of design is approaching problems in new ways. And sometimes we see people that are very open to taking in, working collaboratively and multidisciplinarily, and other times it's trickier. But that's part of coming to college too.
It is coming to
Learning how
college,
to
but
think.
Scott, the way you're both presenting this is as if design is a sort of a laboratory away from the world. When it comes to something like K-12, we've done many shows on the various crises of American K-12 education, lack of funding, the role in which increasingly evangelical groups, radical right evangelical groups are trying to change the nature of education. The profound inequalities, for example, in K-12, where local schools in Palo Alto, where you teach over the road, are incredibly well funded and others in poorer neighborhoods aren't. How do you deal with that with something like education, thinking about design and the real world of, for better or worse, not your fault, of the political realities?
Yeah, I think a lot of what you're talking about has to do with a collective action problem, right? Like, how do we get people and our society to do things in coordination that'll benefit the people that, frankly, a lot of people do want to benefit. But we create systems that make it extremely difficult. We have incentives and we have ways of, designing our society that make it so we're not doing that. I mean, our approach generally, we work with a lot of schools, we work with a lot of school districts, we work with a lot of school leaders, and a lot of it is really just like focusing on what do the students need. And I will say something that's come out of that quite regularly is that schools aren't really just a student need, they're a community need. And so they become a place where you can actually bring the community together. So you have like these efforts of 360-degree education where you're not just educating the students, you're helping the parents, you're providing food, you're thinking about what does this thing do for this community. But yeah, you're right. I mean, there's funding issues, there are ideologies, depending on what state you're in, you're going to learn different things. And I don't think it's anything short of a crisis.
This is a question for both of you, whoever wants to go first. Who is your model designer? Who should we be inspired by as a designer who, in their own field or in their own lives, have done a good job designing what you call a thriving future?
Yeah, we mentioned a couple folks in the book. One I'll highlight here is a guy named Francis Carey. He won the Pritzker Prize, which is the highest honor, and sort of like the Oscars of architecture. He's from Burkina Faso, but works in Germany. And he's gone down to where he grew up. And what he does is he builds hospitals, schools, and these municipal buildings that are really well needed. But the way that he does it, and I think this gets to the important thing I think about when you're talking about people designing, it's not just what they produce, but it's how they produce it. And the way he produces these buildings is by, in part, bringing down, architectural plans, but then he makes sure that he uses local materials. So he'll use concrete mixed with mud to create walls. He'll use local wood. And then he also brings in the local people to build the structure. So his goal is not just to leave behind a hospital that'll function in this environment, but to leave behind the ability to build a hospital in that environment. And I think that's a great example of somebody who is not just delivering a product, but is seeing the act of making something as a way to bring things together rather than split them apart. I think a lot of the things you've been talking about, if you get into like the ideologies in schools, say, a lot of that's sort of pushing us apart, and it's making the collective action much more difficult. He really focuses on like, how do we bring people together so that they can build in a way that's going to be useful for them long term, and not, it's great to build a new hospital. That's also a service. But to build a new hospital and leave behind the ability to build another one is another thing altogether.
I want to come to Carissa. I just had a follow up on that. Do you think that the D School itself is a good example of design? I know that it was originally called the Hasso-Plattner Institute of Design, and it was inspired, perhaps founded and funded in some way by Hasso-Plattner, the co-founder of the German software company SAP. Nothing very local about that.
Yeah, I mean, we still are called the Hasso-Plattner Institute of Design. He did give us our founding gift, and we're grateful for what that kicked off. I mean, your question of are we good design? I think it's really cool to see how this institution has evolved if you look back over the course of the last 20 years. And Scott was behind a lot of this, but because he's been instrumental in designing the D School spaces. But when the D School began, it was in a double wide trailer because it was an experiment. Will people come to this idea of making together in groups and working on important real world problems? When it was clear that yes, they would, then the university actually gave the D School a little bit more space, albeit temporary. And when the current building that we're in, that you see a snippet of in the image you have up on the screen, when that was secured and being built and designed, Scott's at the helm of what the interior of the building was designed to look like. The D School inhabited 2 other spaces on campus, and what that allowed was us to actively think and live in ways of working and teaching and seeing if they were right for us as an institution and for the students. So it was literally trying on ways of being in the future before we moved into the building we're in. And now even though we're in one building, we keep up the ethos of shaking up how we work within this space, how we're structured, and always looking both inward and outward as to how we're doing.
Yeah, it's a fascinating idea of architecture and values and design. When you think of the D School today, it's kind of the equivalent in some ways. I think people have written about this as the cathedrals of the Middle Ages. So, Carissa, let me ask you the same question I asked Scott about your model designer, someone who can inspire your students, the readers of your new book, Assembling Tomorrow. Who would you pick out?
Yeah, I'm gonna pick a person who is a contemporary of ours, and his name is David Kong, and he's a synthetic biologist and a designer of biological systems. He teaches both at MIT and at a large scale people how to edit genetic code. So he's doing really advanced technological work and making that accessible no matter if you're a student at the institution he's at or beyond. And like he parallels all that with his work doing community biohacking events, community organizing. He has a lot of art threads too. He's always looking for new ways, like using music and DJing to bring his bio design concepts to people that access them through that way of being. And I think like that ethos and that way of being a designer is one that I really admire. You can get really technical and specific, but you can also make it very accessible in a way that doesn't dumb it down, but instead welcomes people in a way that means something to them.
It's an interesting idea, Carissa, but some people might be listening to this and be rather chilled with you picking out a designer of quite literally the humanity of tomorrow, and suggesting that they're designing tools or software or technology that will allow anyone to participate in it. Are there some areas where design shouldn't be democratized? Some people would argue that some of this DNA technology, for example, should be locked up and only given access to the most responsible scientists or government officials.
Yes. I mean, I think like this is the conversation we need to be having because things like synthetic biology are moving really quickly, and because our generative AI capabilities are moving really quickly. The pace at how the tech's accelerating and how fast anything you make is released into the world is only accelerating. So the effects are coming at us much quicker. Scott was saying this earlier. The effects of what we're making are coming at us much earlier. That pace in itself is cause for concern amongst all of us. And so we need to find ways for things that are slower moving in society, like regulation, like the natural environment, to be able to catch up, to be as speculative as some of the tech that we're working with. There is absolutely work to be done here.
Scott, I wonder, I'm sure you're familiar with the work of Stuart Brand and his ideas about re-architecting or redesigning dead species. I mean, what do you think of that sort of thing?
Yeah, I haven't know that one in particular. And I'll be honest, that one makes me pretty uncomfortable. I can see the argument for it, right? Like we're responsible for a lot of the cases in which these species have been, vanishing from the planet. And then I can see the argument against it, which is basically just Jurassic Park.
To
And
put it
so
mildly.
yeah. And so, and you can feel both of those things. I think to bring it back a little bit to the, accessibility of, say, tools of making in synthetic biology, I think we kind of need both. We both need access because we can't just have a small group of people understanding this and producing this. And we need regulation. We absolutely need regulation because we can't have, a bad actor or even somebody with good intentions who has too much power and doesn't know what they're doing to be able to work with this. So I think it's a matter of like not really pitting these things against each other, but being realistic about everything, right? Realistic about we don't just want, a couple people in control of everything. And we don't want certain things to just be proliferating everywhere.
But isn't that the reality, Scott? I mean, thinking of Silicon Valley, you're in the middle of it. You have a tiny handful of enormously powerful companies. Thinking of AI, for example, we have OpenAI, which is leading the charge in AI, a private company worth, I think, $150 billion, and then Google competing with them. Isn't that the reality, is that our futures are, for better or worse, certainly not your fault, in the hands of a tiny group of people?
Yeah, that's the current reality. And I think what we're saying is like, can we imagine other possibilities and bring them to fruition? And we might not be able to, frankly. I don't know, am I going to be able to shift the entire policy of the world around so that there isn't so much, and we talk about it in the book as well, the reason those companies are so valuable is because they've been able to pull so much data into one place. And then that data is so valuable and so useful that it then creates within a capitalist economy just a huge amount of money going to one place. And, I think we should be able to imagine something beyond that. Whether or not we'll get there, I don't know.
Well, let's end by imagining it. The subtitle of your new book, Assembling Tomorrow, a wonderful title, is A Guide to Designing a Thriving Future, from the Stanford D School. So I know this is a big question, a broad question, Carissa, but what exactly does a thriving future look like? Is it capitalist? Is it socialist? Is it sexist? Is it machine-led? What exactly does a thriving future? It's such an amorphous concept. What does it mean to you?
Well, it's definitely not sexist, and it's created by all of us. All of us. I think it's not up to me to say what that thriving is. However, I think it's a world that works for more people, and it's made by more people, and it represents them because of that.
Isn't that the opposite of the world today, particularly in America? Tiny group of elites, economically, culturally, politically, educationally, determining our futures.
The continuum as a device is one of my favorite, very simple structures of mapping. And it's fascinating as a tool, as a line with two arrows. And I think it's important to know that, like, as society, like as a collectively created and designed utopia versus a dystopian, sexist, capitalist only type place, like, it's not an either or. Like, we have the ability to pull in pieces of many different realities and create a preferred one that works for many of us. And I I believe that being optimistic is important, but you can't be naive to the fact of the problems of the world that you're in today.
What do you think, Carissa, of some of the more utopian ideas of starting again? There's a multi-billion-dollar community being formed over in the East Bay. There's Peter Thiel's idea of offshore communities. Can there be a new beginning to design, or do we always need to work within some sort of historical context?
I think we always have the historical context. I appreciate experimentation. I also that we have a line in the book. Even utopias have sewage systems, and I think
I would
that's
hope so.
well. I mean, I think that's a reality, right? Like you have to think through the plumbing of how things work. There's always going to be waste. Another one of our main messages is, even if everything works as planned, it's going to affect some other system. Everything breaks something, and it's all of our responsibility to pay attention to what we're breaking along the way. But that doesn't mean we shouldn't keep trying to make progress and make things better.
Well, Scott, let's end with you. Carissa put it beautifully. Even utopias have, and you both wrote this, even utopias have sewage systems. So what is the plumbing of a thriving future? How would you describe this plumbing, the backbone, the thing that makes it work?
That's a beautiful question, I think. Two things I'd point to on that. One, there's an economist over at Oxford named Kate Raworth, who I
Yeah,
actually
who's
think,
actually
yeah,
what's his name?
Roman,
Roman.
Yeah, the
Kisnarek.
husband, so the wife.
Yeah, yeah. She
Donut
has,
economics.
yeah, yeah, donut economics. And I think it's just, a beautiful idea where, what we make should be able to exist within the natural world and create a sustainable world. And it should allow people to live and not harm people. So whatever we can do within that belt is what it should be, but those should be the limits. And I find it hard to imagine anyone would agree with that. But then what she talks about as
To
well,
disagree, you mean?
I'm
Not
sorry,
agree.
disagree. Yes. Thanks for correcting me on that. But then the thing I was going to say is the other thing that she goes into is like, can't we think beyond the current things? So you mentioned like capitalism, socialism, those were all invented to deal with an industrial economy. We should be looking to something new. And I think that, there may be hints of it with, I don't know, maybe there's something about a digital economy that feels different that could create a new system. I think, though, I don't know what it's going to be, that plumbing. I think it's going to be something different than we've had in the past. And I think that makes this a pretty important time because we want to get that right, or as close to right as we can.
I just got to ask you one final question.
Mhm.
Carissa, Scott brought up Kate Raworth is one of the pioneers of regenerative agriculture and rethinking the soil. Do you think that's where perhaps designing a thriving future will begin, in the soil, in a new kind of agriculture? Both Raworth and our husband are very much focused on rethinking agriculture and our relationship to nature.
Very well could. I think that's a great place to be focusing. We have a domain of climate and oceans focus within our design major because we believe that, like, that is one very prime context for design work.
Well, maybe you should rename the book Growing the Future. Anyway, fascinating conversation. Thank you both so much. It's a really important and interesting new book by two teachers at Stanford's D School, Scott Dooley and Carissa Carter. Love to get you guys back on the show. Still a lot to discuss. Thank you.